The Tough Project. In 1862, U.S. President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act and made it a law. It authorized the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad Company to jointly build the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad. Congress decided to raise the funds to finance the project by issuing government bonds. They also authorized the federal government to issue the stocks with a face value of $100, the amount of which reached up to 1 million stocks. The companies in charge of building the Pacific Railroad acquired land from the government, with the total area even bigger than the whole state of Texas. This motivated the two companies to speed up construction so they could gain more profits. The total length of the west line of the Pacific Railroad in California is 130 miles. Even though it only accounts for 1/5 of the total length of the railroad, this part of the line was the toughest to build because of the number of miles in the mountain ranges, along with the year-long snow. Pulling soil with horse-drawn carts. The horsepower of the steaming train was so low at that time that it couldn't even climb up the road with 5 degrees of slope. As a result, whenever there was a mountain or slope, Chinese workers needed to dig tunnels or ditches. Nevertheless, Chinese workers started building the railroad using the simplest tools such as horse wagons to transport rocks and earth. Main laborers in the western section. From 1865 to 1869, roughly 12,000 to 14,000 Chinese workers toiled for the construction of the railroad, which accounted for 90% of the total workers. Construction of 50 bridges. The toughest part of the project was the line from the west to the east, where the railroad went through the Sierra Nevada mountains, which were 2,100 meters above sea level. The first 40 miles of the line had to be built through the mountain ranges, including the construction of 50 bridges and 10 tunnels. Working in 44 blizzards. The harsh winter of 1866 brought 44 blizzards, which shocked the Cantonese workers who had rarely seen snow before. However, the construction was not halted because of this. Every white worker was in charge of 20 to 30 Chinese workers, who were divided into 3 shifts each day, whereas white workers were working for 8 hours per day with 2 shifts. Buried by the avalanche. During the brutal winter of 1867, an avalanche buried a camp accommodating 18 Chinese workers. 50 workers spent 12 hours and saved 15 of them. Later, 20 Chinese workers lost their lives in another avalanche. When their bodies were found in spring next year, some hands were still holding shovels and spades. 60-kilometer ice trail. In the winter of 1867, the temperature dropped to negative 23 degrees Celsius, halting all transportation for the project. When the American engineers felt helpless to cope with this challenge, the brilliant Chinese workers managed to build a 60-kilometer-long ice trail to tow the supplies, which greatly facilitated the progress of the whole project. Build a snow shelter. In order to mitigate the impact of the avalanche, Chinese workers used their experiences and skills in farming to design and build giant anti-snow work tents while digging tunnels. These tents covered and protected the railway and its foundation. Wooden snowproof wall. This image shows Chinese workers constructing wooden anti-snow walls for 60 kilometers along the railroad, where avalanches often occurred. Construction on the cliffs. Cape Horn is like a giant granite wall. The lower part of it is a steep and slippery cliff with a depth of 1,000 feet, approximately 305 meters. Hammers and steel drill. Chinese workers tied a rope around their waists and hung in the air while using hammers and steel chisels to carve out small roads on the mountains. Then, they slowly expanded the roads to allow the passing of wagons. Workflow. The drawing here shows the workflow of Chinese workers digging tunnels on the cliffs. Fall off a cliff. Chinese workers who worked on the cliffs always bore the risk of falling off the cliff if a rope around their waist was worn off or broken due to an explosion, making railroad workers the most hazardous occupation at that time. If not for making a living and raising their families, who would risk their lives working on this job? Fort Point Cut. Digging a tunnel through a mountain required an explosive. All the risky work related to explosives was done by Chinese workers. The miserable experiences of many Chinese workers were buried underneath the explosion sites. Dangerous high explosives. The traditional black powder didn't work well on hard granite. In order to not delay the construction progress, the Central Pacific Railroad Company asked James Howden to make and test out nitroglycerin on the site of Tunnel 6 in February 1867. This image shows the risky scene when examining explosives. Frequent explosions. Noble invented nitroglycerin as an explosive in 1864. Due to its danger, the California government banned its transportation within the state. However, on the construction site of the Central Pacific Railroad, Chinese workers were required to risk trying out nitroglycerin, which led to explosive accidents constantly. Life lost. With the usage of powerful explosives, the construction progress had been accelerated. However, many Chinese workers got injured or even died in the frequent explosions. Dig a shaft. At the end of November 1866, the project of digging tunnels was carried out without any delay, although the snow accumulated up to 50 feet. In order to accelerate the construction, Chinese workers decided to dig from two sides of the tunnel simultaneously. They dug down a well from the top at first until the bottom of the well was aligned with the expected tunnel 4. Then, from the bottom of the well, they dug towards two sides to build a tunnel. It took 85 days to simply dig the well. The mountain was made up of granite rocks. In the beginning, Chinese workers could barely complete up to a foot every day. The first chisel tunnel. Chinese workers were divided into 3 groups. Each group was made up of 30 to 40 people. They shifted to working for 24 hours. After 13 months, the first chisel tunnel was finally completed. A water delivery worker. Tunnel 8 is another tunnel dug with nitroglycerin as an explosive. This image shows a Chinese worker carrying drinking water to those who worked continuous shifts. A pine tree witnessing the history. On the top of the tunnel that Chinese workers have built, there stands a pine tree over 100 years old. It recently bent over about 90 degrees, which seemed like bending and showing respect to those Chinese workers. Hand-chisel tunnel penetration. Tunnel 6 was completed in August 1867. Without any electricity and steaming power, Chinese workers simply used hand chisels to manually dig a tunnel of 1,659 feet. The highest part of the tunnel reached up to 124 feet with a margin of error with no more than 2 inches. 15 chisel tunnels. In the fall of 1867, Chinese workers completed 15 tunnels at the high elevation area of Sierra Nevada mountain ranges, with a total length of 1,894 meters. The Proud Chinese Worker. The first passenger train of the Central Pacific Railroad Company rolled through Tunnel 6 on June 18, 1868. General Strike. Chinese workers at the railroad construction sites went on a non-violent strike for 8 days in June 1867. The strikers requested the same pay as white workers, with monthly salaries being raised from $35 to $40. They also demanded shorter hours, especially in the cramped, dangerous tunnels, to be 8 hours, and permission to leave the railroad project freely for other working opportunities. Leland Stanford ultimately undercut their show of force by cutting off all provisions to Chinese workers. The company did not raise the Chinese workers' salaries and instead warned the Chinese would be responsible for all the delays and losses due to the strike. Chinese workers could not tolerate being famished and therefore had to go back to work. Into the desert. The Central Pacific Railroad Company from the west and the Union Pacific Railroad Company from the east were both getting closer to the meeting point of the Promontory Summit on April 28, 1869. $10,000 bet. At the point of the last 14 miles to the meeting place, the engineers from both railroad companies bet on $10,000 to see who can hit the record of laying 7-mile tracks per day. The Central Pacific Railroad Company picked a group of Chinese and Irish workers and promised them to raise their salaries by 4 times if they completed the task. Eventually, these workers worked for 12 hours a day and laid a track of more than 10 miles. To win the race. The Central Pacific Railroad Company won the bet. However, only 8 Irish workers' names were recorded in history, with none of the Chinese workers mentioned at all. Competition Commemorative Plaque. On April 28, 1869, the Central Pacific crews laid a record of 10 miles of track in a single day. They are contributors. Many people think Chinese workers created a construction miracle. However, the Central Pacific Railroad Company did not record any accidental deaths during the construction of the railroads. Based on historical documents, approximately 2,000 Chinese workers died from avalanches, landslides, explosions, falls, diseases, and other accidents during the railroad construction. Chinese workers built the railroad, which connected the United States from the west to the east. Say goodbye. The construction supervisor of the Central Pacific Railroad Company and the Chinese workers took a picture together after the railroad was completed. Early completion. At the onset of Pacific Railroad construction in January 1863, 2 railroad companies expected to complete the project in at least 14 years. However, with the tremendous efforts of Chinese workers, the country was connected from the east to the west within 7 years. East-West Railways meet. After 2,313 days of hard work, the Central Pacific Railroad Company completed the construction of a railroad of 690 miles and met with the tracks built by the Union Pacific Railroad Company at the Promontory Summit in Utah on May 10, 1869. However, no Chinese face could be found on the picture of the completion celebration ceremony with the last spike hammered down on the railroad. The picture shows the chief engineers from Central Pacific Railroad Company and Union Pacific Railroad Company shaking hands to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. U.S. National Celebration. 8 Chinese workers were chosen to lay the last rail on the morning of May 10, 1869. Historian J.N. Bowman stated that the last spike on the railroad was likely to be tapped by a Chinese worker from the Central Pacific Railroad Company. The ceremony celebrating the completion of the transcontinental railroad lines was held at the Promontory Summit in Utah. As the last spike was driven into the Utah desert by Leland Stanford, the blows were heard across the country. The world was put on notice. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and America was moving to the forefront of the world stage. Chinese workers created a miracle. Leland Stanford, president of Central Pacific, former California governor, and founder of Stanford University, told Congress in 1865 that the majority of the railroad labor force was Chinese. "Without them," he said, "it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national enterprise within the time required by the acts of Congress." Honored Chinese worker representatives. During the celebration at Promontory, James Harvey Strobridge invited 8 Chinese workers to dine in his boarding car. When they entered, all the guests and officers present cheered them as the chosen representatives of the race, a tribute they well deserved. The railroad opening. The Transcontinental Railroad connecting the west and the east of the United States opened for through traffic ahead of schedule. Happy passengers. According to CP Railroad worker payroll records, the proportion of Chinese workers was as high as 95% in the later stages of the project. The picture shows the Chinese road maintenance workers waving to the passing train. A support of the U.S. economy. In 1869, it took only 7 days to travel from New York to San Francisco by train. Since then, this powerful infrastructure has become a great support for the U.S. economy.